majority, because I
So
think
they want to be brainwashed.
I think
They don't want the full truth.
the majority of people want a strong state to safeguard an emergent civil society, but more importantly, they want a strong state to ensure the economic recovery of the country, to rein in the kind of corruption that I think many Russians argue ran right.
Transparency International says corruption's getting worse under Putin.
Well,
their rating's gone down. Corruption's getting worse.
I understand that some of those arguments are made. I really wonder if it's gotten worse. It's been pervasive and it's been problematic long time in Russian history. And I might add, we know that it was pervasive in Soviet times as well. You know, it isn't as if this hasn't been a strong
But you just said that they like Putin because he's fighting corruption and they want to put an end to corruption.
Well, I think the idea here was bringing down elements that were seen as inimical to the interests of the society overall. And I think that whether we're talking about Berezovsky, Gusinski, Khodorkovsky, these were all businessmen who were seen as individuals who had taken part in the great rip-off of property, of the collective property of the Russian people.
Putin apologists love to mention the rich oligarchs of the 1990s. But Moscow still has more billionaires than any other country. The arrangement today is that they can keep their fortunes, but only if they support the Kremlin.
Russia, autocracy or democracy? Combination of both, what do you think?
I call it an emerging democracy.
An emerging democracy.
I want to leave the word emerging in. I've seen
But they've become less democratic in the last 10 years. So they're emerging. It's emerging. Isn't it more accurate to say an emerging autocracy? And the direction the last 10 years has been towards autocracy. How can you say emerging democracy? It's an emerging autocracy.
I can't say that, since 10 years ago it was a failing state and it's a less failing state now.
Dr. Willerton is a smart man, very smart. But how anyone at this point can call Russia an emerging democracy, to me, is appallingly ignorant. As the sun sets on our interview, I read Dr. Willerton a quote from the Soviet dissident Natan Sharansky, and I ask a final question. And his answer perhaps explains why too many in the West don't understand Russia.
For those living in a free society, the idea that a state would try to thoroughly brainwash its subjects is particularly difficult to grasp. Basically, he's saying that in his point of view, a lot of Westerners are naive. The last 5 years, Pat, how much time have you spent in Putin's Russia?
Probably the equivalent of a couple of months.
The campus where Dr. Willerton teaches, writes, and thinks is a warm paradise, a sprawling country club of youthful joy, hope, and easy freedom. Here one hopes for the best, and human nature seems universally good. Dr. Willerton is like most Americans. He takes his rights for granted. We don't fear the police. We don't fear arbitrary arrest and a corrupt legal system. Our rights are protected by America's best attorneys. In America, the Constitution and the law are supreme, not the ambitions and desire of a single man. In Russia, you see, you can feel the censorship, feel the control, feel the paranoid fist of the state, and feel the fear. The KGB, the torture, the gulag is only a generation away. Silence, they remember, and going along are a way to survive. What's sad about television news in Russia is that while it serves the ruling elite, it doesn't help ordinary people. Independent journalists expose corruption, expose problems, and force those in power to admit mistakes and to make changes and to improve life for common people. One reason the Soviet Union was a failure was that problems were ignored, and reform and progress never took place, and average people suffered and life got worse.
A modern society requires a more or less independent and combative media. And it's not just some abstract principle that people should be informed, that they have the right to know. I think they do. Right. I'm a journalist, but it's also that someone has to tell power what's really going on. And it was the congenital defect of the Soviet system that, I mean, among other things, among other disreputable aspects of their propaganda system, it had the effect of keeping Soviet leaders in a bubble in which they only heard what they wanted to hear, and the system became increasingly dysfunctional because of that.
The Soviet system was broken, and while living standards and life expectancy got worse, the Soviet elite ate caviar and did nothing, and the system went into a period of deep stagnation. Soviet leaders were out of touch, and something similar may be happening in Russia today.
But a lot of mid-level officialdom is, and you get increasingly a situation where officials are not only misinformed, but they are protected from their own misdeeds and abuses by reporters who won't report on them. In short, we're headed toward, once again, a system that is arrogant and closed and also ignorant of its own flaws, and that's a fatal problem.
Russia, like all countries, has enormous problems. But in Russia, the problems are painfully depressing. The average life expectancy in Russia for men is an astonishing 59 years of age. Alcohol abuse, heart disease, and domestic violence are old problems that aren't being addressed. And tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS is on the rise. Corruption is out of control and getting worse. Russia's army desperately needs reform, and conscripts are still being beaten to death by their fellow soldiers. Russia's list of problems is long, but that's not the point. The point is whether or not there's a free media that forces the government to prioritize these problems and improve the lives of ordinary people. Television barely covers these problems. The Kremlin likes positive news. Authorities recently ordered that at least 50% of stories about Russia must be positive. What Russians are told is that their leaders are doing a great job and that everything is under control.
Most Russian people have no way of checking out whether this is true. What's the alternative source of information? Most Russian people don't have satellite television. They can't watch any channels. Most Russian people don't speak foreign languages to watch foreign channels and compare. How can they compare? They have to buy it or just ignore it.
And in the fall of 2008, incredibly, Russians were told that the global financial crisis would not affect Russia.
The Prime Minister of the country, Mr. Putin, and as I said, the real head of state of this country, said exactly the following. He said, the crisis is over. It was September 16.
They were told that Russia was an island of stability. Kremlin censors banned the use of the word crisis. And even in the face of economic data that a child could understand, Russians were told to relax and not worry, that Russia was immune from the crisis.
И, кроме того, понятно, что сегодня, когда
And it's also understandable that today, with the economic crisis upon us, each person is experiencing the consequences. And on TV, they say all is fine, that it's not that bad. Well, then a person starts to think, something here isn't fitting together. There's a contradiction here.
Что что-то не сходится.
But they just don't have a way of, hearing an alternative view on this. They're being told that everything is under control, and unless their personal experience shows otherwise, they'll go with it.
And personal experience, especially in a financial crisis, inevitably contradicts the Kremlin's lies. Russians are told on the TV news that here there isn't a financial crisis, that Russia is an island of stability. Yet when Muscovites walk around and look at their once booming construction sites, they see that construction has stopped. Russians have to believe not what they hear on the news, but what they see with their own eyes. And a worldwide credit freeze that stops construction is just the tip of the iceberg. Russians read about their stock market, and they hear about job layoffs. And what Russians really follow, the exchange rate of their ruble, well, when that begins to drop, Russians really get nervous and begin to see things as they are, not as they are told on television.
Президент России Владимир Дмитрий Анатольевич Медведев.
And finally, authorities are forced to admit there's a crisis. But Putin and Medvedev admit no mistakes and accept no responsibility. And sadly, tragically, on Russian TV there is no discussion and no debate. Did the government do enough to minimize the crisis? Is the government properly investing oil and gas money in Russia? Why did Putin deny that a crisis was looming?
That's what we're all about. Keeping them honest,
These are all fair questions, and questions that would be asked again and again in a free society. But on Russian TV, there is no debate and no analysis, and one wonders if Russia's elite, like Soviet bosses, are in a bubble. As I mentioned earlier, I like Russia, and I feel I've been blessed to live here and meet thousands of interesting and wonderful people. But Russians are cynical, very cynical, about politics. And there's an apathy and indifference about national politics, a belief that it's pointless to fight for better governance and accountability, a belief that nothing will change.
I do believe that freedom is something you make. And it's not for me to tell Russians what to do, but I often watch them and wish they would push back and make the space. They don't, and history explains a lot of that.
Russians have had more than their share of upheaval, crisis, and revolution, and they value the calm and stability of the past 9 years. Life for many Russians has improved under Putin. Russians, one can fairly say, have never had it so good, and Putin gets a lot of the credit. I'm sitting at Coffee Mania on Bolshaya Nikitskaya Street. Coffee Mania is one of literally hundreds of very civilized coffee shops all across Moscow. There's no doubt that for many Russians, living standards have improved dramatically over the last 10 years. However, I think it's fair to say that given the dramatic rise in oil and natural gas prices, a rise in living standards, too, was inevitable. In 1999, a year before Putin came to power, the price of oil had fallen to $15 a barrel. Oil prices have risen steadily since then, and prices soared in 2007. Vladimir Putin has been lucky, very lucky. But the Kremlin is nervous about the economic crisis, very nervous, and scared to death of civil unrest. Labor strikes played a significant role in bringing down the USSR. In December, in this interview with reporters loyal to the Kremlin, President Medvedev pointedly warned Russia that unrest in the streets will not be tolerated.
Fox News alert from Moscow. Do they want the Soviet Union back? Well, thousands of people are clashing with police.
And that's exactly what happened. In February 2007, undercover thugs and riot police attacked protesters, including Oleg. Protests like these are shown all over the world, including this video from America's Fox News. But amazingly, absurdly really, dramatic events like this that take place in the very heart of Russia very often are not shown in Russia.
You get the sense that gradually people are starting to realize that they're being lied to?
Yeah, I think it's going. It's happening. Maybe not overnight, but gradually. Yes, they when people participate in a protest and when they see that they are either ignored by the media or there are some lies, they are bad-mouthed, then they realize that maybe it's not just about them. Maybe the whole picture that they see on the TV is not true.
And hopefully, Oleg is right. And Russians will see that the picture they see on television is not true. My hope and my prayer for Russia is peace and prosperity. When the bravest and most honest in society are murdered over and over with impunity, a society loses its conscience and loses its soul. What lies ahead for Russia and for Russia's children, I do not know. In my opinion, Russia doesn't need a revolution or upheaval in the streets. Russia needs honesty. Russia needs the truth. A free media is about more than freedom. Countries with a free media are also more prosperous. Open societies inspire creativity and inspire invention. All I want for Russia and for these children is a bright and happy future. All I want for Russia is the truth.